Hello everyone, the Swiss has finished for Stage 4, which means we have our top 16 teams, and this is important because this is our last ever top 16 teams. Stage 4 is the last stage of the year before the end of year playoffs at DreamHack Stockholm. So this is the last chance to amass circuit points, the last chance to qualify for that LAN. Remember, the top 3 teams from EMEA go through, so it is all to play for. So this is a super important stage for a lot of the top teams, and it's also the last chance in the year for a lot of these up-and-coming teams to really prove they have any worth or move themselves up the standings within the region. So a lot to play for. I think it's worth reminding ourselves as well that actually the winner of this stage, whoever wins Stage 4 playoffs, goes straight to DreamHack. They get a spot in the end of year playoffs, and then the next 2 teams based on the most circuit points will take those 2 other spots. So a lot to play for. Because you can auto qualify here regardless of your circuit points, if you can get a massive upset, you can actually really jump up the rankings if you're maybe like a Twisted Minds or something like that. As it stands right now, circuit points heavily favour Ents and SSG, and then there's Virtus Pro, Twisted Minds, and the new piece of cake team that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later are of a sort of chasing pack. And they're our main 5 candidates who are still in contention for this. So keep that all in mind. But for now, I can show you all the rosters and we can get into these rankings. So if you've not seen this before, you've not seen one of the Power Rankings videos before, we've got all our teams on the left here. The top 4 teams from Stage 3 auto-qualified in the order they finished. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th seed. And then we've got the remaining 12 teams in the order they finish in Swiss, and we've got their rosters here. So tanks in green, DPS in pink, and the supports in blue. So what we're going to do is we're going to make our way through this list. We're going to go 16th all the way up to 1st. Obviously, all of these teams right now are actually divided into groups of 4, and they'll play that group stage to get to our top 8 teams for playoffs. But we're not going to worry too much about the specifics of who's going to get out of what group. I'm going to do every team from 16th to 1st, but hopefully you can then use that ranking, apply it to the groups, and probably figure out who I think is going to come out of where. Right. The other thing that's worth saying as we start here is right now we're in a very macro-heavy meta, really brawly in terms of these Juno Brig compositions. We're seeing lots of Ramattra with it. We're seeing lots of Diva with it. Either way, these compositions are getting mirrored a lot of the time, and when you start mirroring these brawly compositions, what becomes the most important thing is your macro, your ult layering, your understanding like this. And what you can often see is it becomes less of a who has the best player, who is the player who can carry the most type meta, and a little bit more a weak link meta, which means the team with the least weak links wins. You know, if you have 4 very good players, but one player who always makes a mistake when you're doing these big ult trades, then ultimately you're going to get punished for that player making the mistake. And this is why we can often see a shift of power when we get some of these more macro-heavy metas, as it favours some teams more than others. So keep that in mind. I'm going to be using that when ranking the teams because I think that does affect the power level of some of the teams more than others. And we can start, right? We'll start at the bottom. We'll start at number 16. And I'm actually going to start with negative mental attitude. Now, this team was formerly called Ronaldo 7. Presumably, they're not allowed to be called Ronaldo 7 because Ronaldo's lawyers have been on the phone to them. So instead, they've renamed themselves to Negative Mental Attitude. Now, this is a team, I'm not familiar with all of the players. Gucci and Miraculous are the players I'm probably most familiar with, and my impression is they will very much be their best players. But as we just talked about some of the sort of macro versus individual impact we may be able to see in this current meta, I think actually when I've seen Gucci at his best in the tournaments we've seen him in so far, it's been on Tracer, and he's just been able to put in a very big carry performance. I don't know how much Tracer he's going to get to play here. I think you look at the DPS that are in play a lot of the time, it's Ashe, it's May, it's Venture, it's Echo maybe a bit still. There's a decreased amount of Tracer, and even when people are playing Tracer, it's not quite a hard carry Tracer role. So I think negative mental attitude, as much as they did slightly better in this in the Swiss stage, there's nothing about this roster that really convinces me that they'll be able to punch back or punch up rather and cause any major upsets. So bottom of the rankings for me, negative mental attitude. They've manifested their own negative position here. Then after negative mental attitude, there's probably 3 teams that I think are all relatively similarly skilled. And that's Gambit, Hypnos, Meta Boys. Obviously, you can see they all finish pretty closely in Swiss as it is. And I think these teams are full of roster. These rosters are. I think these rosters are ones that people won't be as familiar with. Maybe a few more with Meta Boys because they've been around longer. And I think while these teams have done a good job qualifying and getting into the top 16, I think they're going to struggle to really cause many upsets or get any meaningful results against the bigger teams. So I think they're all going to find themselves towards the bottom of these power rankings, and I'll try and put them in an order that I think makes sense. I think what I'm going to do, some of this is going to be based off what I saw in Swiss, and it's worth saying, here's my caveat, here's my excuse, is The games I saw in Swiss, we were jumping around a lot, so I saw some bits, didn't see other bits. So based on what I saw, though, I'm actually going to put Hypnos towards the bottom here, because I was quite impressed with Hypnos when I saw them play, but the only problem is, I really only saw him play Gibraltar, and I thought Lars looked good on Winston. Bones did a very good job. Maybe Bones is one of the players people are more familiar with, Spanish DPS player, looked very good as well. The problem is most maps aren't Gibraltar. Well, it's good to be able to win Gibraltar, have a good Winston on you, have a good Tracer on you. I feel like the meta is actually going to be way more about how good are you at the Ram/Diva, Juno, Brig comps. That's going to be a more defining factor. So, as much as Hypnos might be quite good at those comps as well, they were clearly good enough either at or into those comps to get into the Swiss. I've just not seen it. So because I've not seen it, really hard for me to justify ranking them much higher compared to some of the other teams, which we'll talk about now, where I have seen them play more of these compositions and looked a bit more effective. And I think a good example of that is actually Team Gambit, who I'm going to put in next. They played a lot of the Juno Brig with Ramatra, and I thought UKEDGE was a standout performer. Whether they were winning, whether they were losing, every time they were having success, it felt like UKEDGE was a key part of it. He was getting massive annihilation value, a load of cleanup kills, and I think a super important part of this roster. And as much as I don't think they have the firepower to take anything off the top teams, I think when we start looking at a few of these bottom teams, I think actually they look pretty reasonable, seem to have a good understanding of how the meta was played, and especially UKEDGE, the standout for me there. Now, at the top of this sort of trio of teams we discussed is going to be the Meta Boys, who are the team who have been around the longest for Polish core. I think the big new player probably for them is Centralapan, if I'm saying that right. A Swedish player, saw him playing mostly Diva, and I think he looked pretty reasonable. I think Meta Boys are a team that maybe suffer a little bit from it being so macro heavy, in the sense that when I always think about when I've seen Meta Boys have their best results, it's always been Fake Jake having tremendous impact, some sort of carry performance, which I think is a little bit harder in this type of meta. So maybe that will limit Fake Jake a little bit. Ultimately, Meta Boys have been playing Brawl compositions all year. Whether it has been meta or not meta, despite their name, they've just been playing Brawl mostly all year. So I think the fact that they've sort of landed on a Brawl meta going to stage 4 probably sits quite nicely for them. And that's why I'm giving the edge out of some of these bottom teams. Then I'm going to actually put Wasp next, which is a little bit lower than where they finished in Swiss. And as much as Wasp are a team I have a lot of time for, really, they're the one-trick team if you've not seen them play before. They've got Ostrix, who plays Ball. Hev plays main Tracer. Gurkmeister, who you might remember from Yeah, who aren't competing in Stage 4, finds himself on this team. And of course, he's playing Junkrat. And then very similarly to Yeah, they have KDM and Chaba playing the backline, just kind of filling on whatever roles make the most sense with whatever version of the comp they're running. So, while always fun to see these one-trick teams and they always have a chance of an upset, I think one thing that benefits Wasp know massively in the Swiss stage is, for the most part, teams don't know they're going to be playing the one-trick team until they're playing the one-trick team. They just get generated for game, you have to play it. Maybe sometimes you get a day's notice because they're going to be your first game of the next day, etc. But for the most part, you run into a lot of teams that are a bit less prepared for you. This can lead to Wasp getting a lot of results that maybe they wouldn't do if the other teams had more preparation. Now we're in the group stage. Every team in Wasp's group know they are in Wasp's group and know they will have to play in this competition at one point or another. And I think the later we got in Swiss, the more we saw teams leaning into a lot more hard counters. We saw Sombras coming out to ruin the Bulls' time. We saw Echo Mercy even in play, or Echo Farah in play, to try and ruin Gurkmeister's time on the Junkrat here. So I think while they still have enough individual quality on their respective heroes to maybe beat these teams below them, who I think are on the weaker side, I think once we get to these other teams, we'll see more counter comps coming out. This will make it really tricky. Suddenly Gurkmeister's not getting the same impact. Ostrix doesn't have the same impact. And if these two players stop having the impact, suddenly I think a big part of Wasp's success all falls apart. And I think this is the same problem that normally run into, where essentially they can always beat a certain level of teams just with their individual quality on their heroes. But once they get to teams with a certain level of team play and counter swapping them, it just becomes too tricky for their heroes. And I think Wasp will end up being a bit of a tier break here in terms of teams who can beat Wasp, teams who can't beat Wasp. So, then we move on to the next sort of chunk of teams. And this is actually, I want to create like a big chunk of teams here, because I think when I look at the rest of EMEA from this point, what I think is these 5 teams, not necessarily in this order, we'll get to that later, but these 5 teams are our top 5 teams. And I think they're our top 5 teams by actually quite a large margin. In the sense, I'd be quite surprised if we see any of these teams upset by the teams below them. But what I think that means is then this sort of 6th to 11th, pretty open and up for grabs as well, especially if we're going to be in one of these sort of brawly macro heavy metas as well, where it's a lot about ult layering. This can really shift the power level, where it's, again, we talked earlier about like weak link meta versus a carry meta. So I think this can shift it around quite a lot, and I think this next group of teams we're going to look at from this sort of 6th to 11th, I think in reality it's actually super competitive between all of them, and we could all see them taking maps off one another. But saying that, it's a power ranking, so I have to put them in order. So I'm going to put them in order in a way that I think makes sense, and the team I want to start with actually is going to be X-Oblivion. Is it going to be X-Oblivion? Maybe I've literally changed my mind as I'm doing it. Yeah, maybe I've changed my mind. All right, I'm going to put X-Oblivion here. X-Oblivion here. And I think the reason I'm moving X-Oblivion up, let me put the team I was going to put. So what I've done just now, live thinking, I've actually changed X-Oblivion and Vendetta around. So we'll talk about both rosters and maybe why I've suddenly maybe shifted X-Oblivion above Vendetta. Now, Vendetta are a team that I ranked quite highly in Stage 3. And that didn't pay off for me at all. And that was completely wrong. And Vendetta had a really, really rough time of it and weren't really able to take any of the potential on their roster and turn it into any meaningful results. Now, for the most part, I still think they have a lot of that big potential. They have China, they have Cookie. This is a great DPS line. The problem is this is maybe the perfect DPS line if you're going to be playing in a Tracer Ashe meta. But maybe if we're going to a Mei Ashe meta or like a Mei Venture meta, this DPS line doesn't look all of a sudden, you know? Likewise, I think they changed the backline, obviously, with Cronus and Ange coming in. So while Cronus and Ange, I don't know if there's really upgrades for roster in terms of quality of support players. I think hopefully at least increases the roster's understanding and, I guess, intelligence. And maybe that benefits them in this kind of macro meta, even though I still have to say huge question marks about maybe less so Cookie, because you can probably just play Ashe, but maybe especially China in this type of meta in terms of we've seen him do very well on Tracer. We've seen him do pretty well on Pharah as well. What heroes is he going to be playing? If he's playing something like Mei, that's a very different hero than Tracer and Pharah. How impactful can he really be on that? Because the standard of Mei in EMEA is actually massive. So I think a big ask for Vendetta, and all of these sort of question marks is why I've ultimately moved them just below X-Oblivion. Because even though X-Oblivion are a relatively new look roster as well, I think one thing that's always been true when I've watched these sort of like Sky Tour rosters is the teams have always been quite smart in the sense that when you watch them play, you can see patterns to their ultimates and how they're making the same decisions in the same situations, which to me is a good demonstration that this team know what they're doing, or at the very least, they have some ideas. They have a plan. They have an idea of how the meta should be played. And I think that's a super important thing for any team to have. And I think especially in these metas, that sort of stuff will be rewarded more heavily. So that's why I've actually shifted X-Oblivion up a little bit here. So up into 10th. I still don't think this is the sort of roster that's going to be too scary for a lot of these top teams. But I think they're a pretty reasonable team. They've always looked to play the meta fairly well. And I expect the same from them here. Then maybe we get into the sort of juicier side of it. I'm actually going to put Team Peps here. Don't know how I feel about the Team Peps. I think we should probably talk about the roster changes. So obviously, there was a point where they were going to have and try and keep this core of players, the Tread, Naga, Zodial core, which I think has looked pretty consistently good throughout the year. But from what I understand, those players weren't interested, wanted to go make their own team. So instead, they did keep FD God, and they've actually gone back to their roots. So considering they weren't able to maybe get exactly who they want, the fact that Fefe and Team Peps have decided to go, we're a French org, let's get the best French team we possibly can. I've actually got loads of time for this. I think it's a really good decision. And I'm excited to see them. As much as people love to hate on the French, if you love to hate on the French, what you want is an all-French team to hate. The old Peps, just one French person. New Peps, loads of French people. So if you love the French, you've got a team to root for. If you hate the French, you've got a team to root against. So loads of time for this. Happy that Peps are back to their roots. And I'm sure they'll be happy to play the heel for a lot of teams in this upcoming stage. As such, we should maybe talk about some of the players individually. I think FD God, maybe not that good the last couple of months, but I think for the most part, FD God has still had a really okay year. I think as much as people love to hate on FD God, love to maybe hate on main supports in general, I think he's actually had a really reasonable year overall, even if the last 2 months been particularly poor. Zirian, a player, I think he's got like a super high talent level. He clearly hits a lot of shots and can have a large impact for his team as a result. I just worry a little bit about like some of his macro decision making. I think in the past, a lot of his Kitsune rushes have felt pretty poor. Maybe paired with a player like Crocs, who would be quite happy to call a lot of the macro, all of these kind of things, and maybe now help as well. Maybe, again, being partnered with someone like FD God, and there's a lot of experience and maybe vocal players around him now that can help out with that a little bit more. Which obviously means we should talk about Crocs. I think Crocs is really a player that everyone just loves because he's just the wild card. You don't know what Crocs is going to do. Maybe he's going to go Junker Queen. Maybe he's going to go Hog. Maybe he's going to go Doomfist. And sometimes it will lose you the round. But sometimes it'll win you a round you're not supposed to win. So Crocs, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's ugly, but it's always interesting when Crocs plays, which I think actually means, as much as, again, lots of people like to hate on the French, I think Crocs is going to win over a lot of fans because Crocs is always a player who's fun to watch play. He's a larger-than-life personality, really. I think he will be the leader of this team, both in-game, out of game. I think he's a really interesting figure to have at the top of this roster, and I think it's more likely that Crocs will make this roster overperform than underperform. And then, so I'm actually talking myself into maybe moving them up the rankings as I say this, but for now I'll leave them in 9th, but I'm actually quite excited to see this roster. I think when we get to the DPS side of things, I think Stelios is a player who's excelled very much on Tracer before, and we saw him playing a lot of Mei in the Swiss, so I think this stage in particular, if Stelios is going to have to keep playing so much of the Mei, big test for Stelios in terms of the actual level he can put on like a non-Tracer hero, essentially, because so far when I've seen Stelios play non-Tracer heroes like Echo and stuff, I've been thoroughly unimpressed. So he looks a little bit better on the Mei in some of the Peps games we saw, so hopefully this is a chance for Stelios to prove he's not just a Tracer guy, he's got a little bit more to him than that. Likewise, Pack, I think, is a player who suits his team very well, highly flexible player, can fill in all the roles, and I think even though he's not even always the star player on his teams, I think he has a positive impact, I think, always when I see him play. So Stelios Pack, I think, was mostly what they were playing during the Swiss, so I'm interested to see more of that, and I think Peps will become a very interesting team to watch with this new team under Crocs' leadership. Now next, and I went back and forth on this one a lot, next I think I'm actually going to put SR Peak Check. Am I? I kind of want to move them up, but let me tell you why I want to move them up. So, as much as SR Peak Check have a lot of the same problems Wasp do, in the fact that while they are very good at the particular competitions they play, they do run into issues in the fact that they kind of only play one archetype of comp, or very particular heroes in some cases, which means they're very easy to prepare for, and very easy to counter comp in some situations. Now, I will say that actually I think SR Peak Check's comp is a lot harder to counter. It still has more counterplay opportunities. The fact that they have Sim, they're running Junkrat with it now, which is, I guess, is an option. I think SR Peak Check's version of a comp has a lot more abilities to adapt and play differently. You see they're still playing a lot of the Juno with it as well, and still using it just to speed Cloudy around and TP him and do a lot of the same things. So I think SR Peak Check's comp actually has loads of legs, and I think that's why I've actually still ranked him quite highly up this, I think, as much as we saw the same in Swiss, right? I think they'll beat a lot of the teams below them. But once they get to maybe the top 5 teams, I think it just won't be effective enough. I think a lot of these top teams as well have a really good Ramatra player, or multiple good Ramatra players in some cases. That'll make Cloudy's life really difficult. I mean, I think, again, with the Sim Junk stuff, I think partly because in EMEA, loads of teams try Sim stuff, right? We see SSG have done a lot of it historically. Twisted Minds have done a lot of it historically. What you also have is then an increased... the region has an increased ability against sim teams, which I think, again, makes SR Peak Check's ability to go far a little bit trickier, which is why I've ranked them quite low. And now, I think they did actually play really well in Swiss, and they were probably the team that looked, compare it maybe to Stage 3 to Stage 4, looked like a significant improvement, a lot cleaner on a lot of their decision-making and how their approach to certain maps. And obviously, they do have this X factor in the fact that Cloudy can go off, Danid can go off, even Fire with Junkrat can go off, even Ghost, right? We still see some of the same problems Ghost suffered when he was an Ents, sometimes on rotations or when he has to get into a new position, he has a real bad time. But actually, in terms of can Ghost click on the stuff? Can he keep everyone alive? Yeah, if you can get Ghost to a good position, he can be a really high impact player for SR Peak Check. So I think there's still lots of positives for them in this. And I think out of all the teams I put here, I think SR Peak Check are probably the one I'd say most likely to overperform expectations. Maybe not all the way to the top like this arrow indicates, but maybe over the next couple of teams we're going to talk about particularly. Which, as you probably guessed, if you've done the math right, I told you who my top 5 would be, which leaves 2 teams now to fill this 7th and 6th spot, which is Quick Esports and where are they? And Aoma. Now, Ioma, people are probably quite familiar with as of late. They have a top Dragon team. They've added Ice to the roster, who I think is a very good signing. I think we probably expect Ice to play the most part, with D.Va and Ram being very much meta, and this sits inside Ice's hero pool. I think one of the problems Ioma had in previous tournaments was the fact that Theo didn't feel comfortable swapping on to D.Va, which really not so much limited what Ioma could play, but a lot of the time people use the D.Va to counter out swaps like Ana or Hitscan, or particularly Greedy or like Pharah, greedy DPS and support options. But because Theo didn't have that in his wheelhouse, all of a sudden, I think it was Virtus.pro maybe exploited the most by going, we're just going to run Ana the entire time because we know Theo won't swap. But now with Ice, they will swap. They will put Ice on that D.Va, and we actually saw them have a pretty strong start to the Swiss as a result of some of this as well. They actually went unbeaten, I think, for the first 2 days maybe, but then a really poor third day meant they dropped a lot lower. They dropped down their Swiss rankings quite quickly. But saying all that, I think this roster have done pretty reasonably well before. As much as I think they finished 4th in the FACEIT playoffs, as much as some of that was due to them getting a bye in one of the lower bracket rounds. So maybe 4th is a bit generous based on who they actually had to beat to get there. I think in the end they only beat New Age and got 4th, which, I mean, that's not bad, I guess, but maybe doesn't inspire massive confidence. But I think they did have pretty decent results in Stage 3. And I think they will do very well here as well. And I think, honestly, for my money, have to put them ahead of Quick Esports right now as well, which means they will be taking this 6th spot. Now, again, they're the sort of team, I think, they do rely a little bit on Top Dragon's X Factor, but I think now with Ice, the whole roster just feels, I think, a lot better with Ice in terms of balance for this meta. So, Top Dragon, we've seen him have big impact before. Maybe now with Ice, I think this can actually, the roster has been upgraded, I think. I don't expect we'll see much of Thematic, maybe outside of like some of like Gibraltar's in the pool, right? So maybe there are still Winston maps and timings for that. But I think we'll see Ice for the most part play for this team. And I think that's a positive move for them, and I expect AM to actually do quite well as a result. The other team, obviously, is Quick Esports, which you probably heard Quick Esports at various times, different rosters, every stage, everything like this. This is their version for this stage. And my main reason for belief in this roster, I think, is actually Hitori. I think I'm a big believer in her ability to impact teams. I think whenever she's on a team, that team does particularly well. Think of all the Super Shy rosters she's been on. And I think a lot of this is, again, comes from one, ability to play the hero she needs to play, but also ability to lead the team and to lead a lot of the macro. And I think that will be an important factor in this, and why I've actually put Quick quite high. Maybe I want to put below SRP check. I'll deal with that for in a second. I'll finish talking you through the roster. In terms of backlines, I think Yoham and Streb, I think solid backline. I think maybe EMEA has this problem where, like, if I look at maybe these top 3 backlines, maybe this would have been true when it was Vigibliss as well. But, like, there's pretty solid backlines here on a range of heroes. And then once we get outside of that and we get to this, like, Skyle, Crispy, Yoham, Strebor, like, Alpha, Donghun, Takuno, Pratt, like, Cronus Hand, you know, there's all this sort of, like, all these backlines, I kind of look at them and I just go, they're okay. And I don't think there's been many of these backlines that have really stood out to me. In the same way, when I watch, like, Kaneo and Gala play, there's certain times when I'm like, wow, this guy's actually really good. Really huge impact for their team. Similarly, Landon and Astro, plenty of times they're huge impact. When I was watching Vigilante Bliss, plenty of times, maybe especially with Vigilante, who we'll talk about, or maybe we'll talk about his absence more later, huge impact. And I think especially in this Ana Lucio meta, I think Vigilante and Bliss and Sky Kellex have looked absolutely excellent in some of those metas, and they really put their team over the top. When we get outside those sort of top 4 backlines, I think these backlines just kind of look like okay at best. And what I'm really hoping is that eventually, like, a new challenger arises from one of these, you know, like, who can make the step up? And Yoham, Strebor, I think, have been around these sort of, like, top 8, top 16 teams for a while. Maybe this is the occasion, but they've been around sort of all year, and I kind of need to see it to believe it, though. And we'll talk about this from a piece of cake backline as well, but I feel the same about Sky and Crispy. Of, like, they've sort of been around, but I'm waiting for an, I guess, kind of, like, level up performance I've not seen out of them yet. On the rest of the roster, we have Ken, who most people actually know from Arya. So it's actually the most exciting bit of the roster for me, because every time we've talked about Arya in the past, we've always talked about how actually Ken's not just one of these players who is really good on just one particular hero, or he's got a really interesting niche of hero. He's actually just a legitimate DPS player, Tracer, Ashe, a whole range of DPS heroes, and I'm super excited to see how he does on... I'm going to say more legitimate, but I don't want to discredit the one-trick teams because they give it They do give it a proper go, and they get plenty of results as a fact. But seeing him on a more traditional team, maybe that's a better word. A traditional team that are going to play traditional comps, that are going to play the meta, that are going to have more structure to them than Arya and Wasp do. So I'm really excited to see how Ken does. They also have Lauren there, who is a player I've really been unconvinced by in a lot of his performances. So as much as I think there's some bright spots on Quick, I think in terms of Hitori and Ken, there's also a lot of a roster that I think actually need to answer questions. And as a result, you know what? These are my original rankings when I put it down, but I'm gonna change it live because I've actually talked myself out of it. I've talked Quick down, so I'm actually gonna move Quick all the way down to 9th here. And let me just check I'm happy with this. Yes, SR peak check go up. Peps into Yeah, I'm happy with this. I've actually talked myself out Quick. I think I was a little bit blinded by Hitori and Ken. I had Hitori and Ken. I had Ken vision on the mind, and all I could see was like, yeah, Ken's gonna prove himself on a traditional team. He's gonna make it work. And actually, there's also a lot of I think Lauren, I've got huge question marks over. I think Johan and Strebo, I don't know if they're going to be stepping up and doing anything to really rival any of these top teamed backlines. Okay, so that brings us on to the top 5. Which is obviously, this is where we get to all the teams that have the biggest chances of qualifying for Stockholm. Only 3 of them can make it. The winner will auto-qualify. And then it's all about circuit points. And again, SSG Ents, as we said at the start, huge advantage in circuit points. But we'll just focus on stage 4 as a little bit of a bubble and just who we think is the best team. Now, before we get to the best team, we probably have to start with the worst team out of these top 5. And I think I'm actually going to put Twisted Minds in at 5th here. And a big part of the reason is Vigilante leaving, going back to Korea, and MCD coming in. Now, MCD is a player who I've never rated particularly highly for any of his time in Overwatch League. I think he did actually have a bit of a redemption on Hypnos, particularly playing Ana. I don't know how much Ana he's going to really be able to play in the current meta. I think he's worse than Vigilante in pretty much every way on every hero. I think he's probably still a reasonable enough flex support, but it's a massive downgrade. So I think Twisted Minds are going to drop off a little bit here, as much as lots of other things are good for them, right? You talk about it being a Diva and Ram centric meta, good for TVNT. Yubi can play a lot of Mei, one of his best heroes. Can Quartz play Ashe? Yes, okay. All starts to work out. Maybe some question marks for like how MCD and Bliss will fit into like a Juno Brig type backline as well. So as much as there's some positives here for Twisted Minds, I think particularly for TVNT and for Yubi. I think MCD is a massive downgrade over Vigilante. I think as a result, we're going to see a bit of a fall off here as well. I don't think like massively. I think they still have significant quality over most of the EMEA. But I think when I get to the team I'm going to put above them, Piece of Cake, who are the team I am going to put in 4th. I think actually Piece of Cake, Tread, Naga, Zodial, this core have been together for most of the year. And I think I'm actually reasonably big believers in this. I think Zodial especially has been super impressive lately. But I think what's been most impressive about how impressive he has been lately, that was a good sentence, Xavier, good job. What's been most impressive about Zodial lately is that all his good performances are coming on flex DPS heroes, not on the hit scan heroes we originally associated with him. So I think Zodial has really proven himself as a very modern DPS player, can play over heroes, excel on all these roles, and I think that's a super important thing to have. As much as it's nice to have flexibility in your roster, we can sub in our second flex DPS player, maybe like Ents can, with Kevin Wamone. It's also even better if you can have flexibility built into the roster. And I think Naga and Zodial are actually looking like a very effective DPS duo in this meta. Mei, a very good hero for Naga. And the fact that Zodial can swap between Ashe and some of the other heroes, I think is actually a massive asset to this team. Similarly, Diva and Ramatra, very much in Tread's wheelhouse too. When I think back to this core of players, whether they were the Gaming Gladiators or Peps or whatever they were named at the time, when they had their biggest success was in the Malga meta. And what characterized that meta the most was it was quite broadly meta, quite a macro-heavy meta, all about ult layering, all about having these sort of complicated fight plans with lots of steps, making sure everyone listens to them and follows them, all of this. So I think actually this type of meta might suit Piece of Cake perfectly, and that's why, for my money, they're going to finish above Twisted Minds. Is that enough when we do the circuit point math and all of this to get them to Stockholm? I don't know. But I think if there's a type of meta we've seen this team perform best on in the past, it has been this type of meta. I think their roster, backline, as we sort of discussed earlier, I think it's okay. But if it's just a weak link meta and it's about who makes the least mistakes, maybe that's okay for them as well. Not the sort of thing where they have to put in these big carry performances, right? We talked a little bit about previous meta where we saw Vigilante and Sky Ripper when they were playing Ana Lucio type competitions really excel. Maybe those type of comps aren't going to be that viable, so therefore the difference that maybe a player like Sky Ripper or Vigi or someone like that could have is very much minimized. So maybe that'll actually work in Piece of Cake's favor as well. So for my money, Piece of Cake above Twisted Minds. Maybe still just miss out on Stockholm, but I think should be a good meta for them. Then we get to our top 3. Now, Virtus Pro, I think they're a team that they're trending up. They're always doing well. They're getting results against teams consistently. But I feel like once we enter this sort of like the heavy hitters, right? And that's where we are, right? We're in the heavy hitters. I think VP still feel a little bit like the younger brother, you know, like SSG and ENCE are still the main people, and Virtus Pro are just on the outside all the time. I think when we look at maybe when it's type of meta and what it focuses on, I think suddenly it's maybe one that forces Cloud into the team a lot more because it's more Mei focused. And I don't know if Cloud's really impressed me as much as I guess I've been impressed by Sora and Shockwave when we're playing their respective heroes. So I'm a little bit question marks about Cloud, especially when we look at the other DPS players in this sort of mix, right? If we go through this top 5 and we look at the Mei players in terms of Naga, Yubi, Backbone, Cloud, Kevster, I actually think Cloud's probably the worst out of these 5, and I think Mei is such a strong hero right now, so important, so powerful, really game-winning, fight-winning ultimate, game-winning, fight-winning cooldowns in a lot of these engages. I think it's actually a massive downgrade for them. I think on the balance, they're still better than Piece of Cake, still better than Twisted Minds. They will still have a good macro understanding. They'll still be one of the best teams. They're still going to finish 3rd, right? As much as we're talking about some of the downsides of their team. All of this should be taken with the fact that we still think they're the 3rd best team in the region. I think obviously the fact that Smash has returned to the lineup is actually massive for them. Again, they've had their best results at the Esports World Cup under Smash's coaching. So lots of positives here. I just don't know if meta lines up for them perfectly. I think Kaneo has had some struggles on Brigitte. As much as Gala's Juno looks like one of the better ones, the Brig for Kaneo does seem to have been a struggle. Likewise, the DPS doesn't line up as nicely. And then when we get over to Diva and Ramatra, I think this is really fine for Rajara, so we don't have to worry about that aspect of it. But I think, yeah, the DPS side and the Brig side concerns for Virtus Pro. So while they should still be really, still be one of the best teams, I do think this meta maybe isn't perfect for them. And I think if any team is maybe going to get upset by Piece of Cake or something, maybe Virtus Pro are the most vulnerable. And obviously, I don't know exactly how the math works out in terms of circuit points and who finishes where, but maybe that's like the big concern for Virtus Pro. So if these two teams run into each other, I think it's super important for Virtus Pro to come out on top. I mean, that's going to end up maybe being like a crucial game. I think like if I'm the Piece of Cake team, I'm actually really fancying my chances against maybe Virtus Pro in this type of meta. Then once we get to the top 2 teams, I think actually, as much as I did go ENCE's way last time around, I'm all in on SSG. One, the fact that they won Face It playoffs in convincing style in this type of meta is probably a pretty good indication overall that they'll do quite well. The fact that they've done that, then added KSA, and we talk about it being a Diva and Ram focused meta, and well, that's pretty reasonable, pretty good time to have KSA on the roster. You have to ask the age-old question you always ask with this SSG core of, can they incorporate a new player into the London system? They've failed at that in the past, but at this point in the year, it's been 9 months, and Astro and Psycho have been integrated, I think, no problem. I think KSA comes from a roster in that Twisted Minds core where they had a very clear structure in terms of everything comes from Yubi. They do his fight plans, they play how he wants to play. I think the fact that KSA's played very much in a system team before make him very adept at fitting into SSG here. So I'm not too worried about KSA coming in. I think actually it'll just be very plug and play, given the amount of time they've had him before they actually have to play their first meaningful games. So I think just so many positives for SSG here, and it should just be their stage. I think they'll get the auto qualification spot and that better seeding spot going into Stockholm. I think everything looking up for SSG right now, which means obviously that ENCE is in 2nd place. And I think with ENCE, again, a really strong roster. I like a lot of what they're doing with Kev and using Ramon a lot more as well. So I think they look really strong on that side of things. I think the way they're doing the Juno Brig as well, with Kellex playing a lot of the Brig, Sky moving on to the Juno, maybe it makes it a little bit hard for him in terms of doing like Ana swaps or stuff like this. But for the most part, I still think they look like one of the best teams. And I think really what we're going to see, if you ask me, yeah, I said there was a top 5 before, right? But I think if you wanted me to break this top 5 down more, I think SSG and ENCE are in their own category. So I think ENCE notably better than the other top teams, definitely better than the rest of the pack. I think the fact is now, everything just looks too good for SSG in terms of how the meta's lining up, in terms of the addition of KSA. Everything's lining up too much for SSG not to put them on top right now. So these are my final rankings. Let me just do a bit of a sense check and make sure I'm happy with everything, because I changed a few of these live as well. But yeah, SSG on top, no problem with that. ENCE second, no problem with that. Virtus Pro, yeah, pretty confident with that. Piece of Cake in 4th above Twisted Minds, I think reasonable. Yeah, Piece of Cake, there is a chance for him to jump up. A one-man army, yeah, reasonable. Honestly, SRP check, I nearly even put them higher, nearly even put them into 6th. I'm actually their Swiss really convinced me. Not just in the fact that they did well in Swiss, but in terms of like how they were playing when we were watching like on Cloudy and Ghost Stream and stuff. So quite hot on SRP check right now. Then Team Peps. Actually, a lot of love for Crocs, a lot of love for Team Peps in general, actually, because of I'm just excited to watch Crocs play and see what he does. I can't wait. I actually can't wait. Then Quick Esports as a result down here. Yeah, I think, again, big fan of Hitori, big fan of Ken, but I think big question marks in other parts of the roster. XO Vendetta, yeah. I really do want Vendetta. I'm rooting for Vendetta to do better. I'm just really not convinced they will, unfortunately. Okay, so I'm looking at it. I think I'm happy with it. Lock them in, knows the rankings, print it, send it, put it on Twitter, whatever it is, knows the rankings for Stage 4. I think I'm locking them in, okay? So, obviously, if you have your own rankings, if you disagree with something I said, disagree with some of the rankings, am I underrating a certain team, overrating a certain team, anything like that, let me know in the comments, let me know your own power rankings, let me know who you think will be going to Stockholm. Those are my rankings, I'm going to stand by them. Let me know your own rankings. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did. We'll have the NA Power Rankings and a lot more coverage coming out across the event as well. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you in the next one.